Thank you, Barb. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde. It's late in the day, so if all of you who aren't comfortable would like to make yourselves comfortable right now, now would be a good time. But I promise you not to keep you too long from your nap or a drink, whatever your preference. Now, just to help me out a bit, if I could by a show of hands find out how many here are professionals.
You mean professional?
Well, professional in this area. How many are brain injured? Okay, and how many are the collaterally damaged family members? So I see some hands up that for two of the categories. So now I'm one of the collaterally damaged family as well, and tomorrow one of the other collaterally damaged family members here is going to be giving a talk, and I think it's in the afternoon, mid-afternoon. But I'm talking as a father, a parent, and she will be speaking as a daughter. So seeing those two different approaches to the experience, and she was a teenager when this occurred to her, so she was conscious and aware of it. This will, I think, help a lot in terms of making that adjustment, to how we each approach that particular experience. The book here and on this, the poster and at the back, I will be reading some excerpts. It started as an article for the brain injury community in Southern Ontario, and then a professor of nursing read it and saw its potential for teaching nurses. And she asked me if I would consider writing a book for that purpose. And I said, well, I'm a total neophyte. I'm not a professional. I couldn't possibly write something that would have validation within nursing schools. But, and I thought this was my out, I will write it if you will commit to working with me on it, to provide that professional legitimacy. And she walked through the door. And so the two of us worked on it starting a little over 14 months ago, and it became published in the spring. The initial draft about a year ago, about 10 months ago, she took out to a number of professional colleagues in British Columbia, nursing school, hospital, rehabilitation hospital, and they said, yeah, we'll buy it. And they've carried through with it. So we've had a bit of a journey with that, and initially I was very reluctant to write it for all kinds of reasons, and but ultimately decided to proceed with it, and really that step was taken when I decided to write it under a pseudonym. I don't understand that, why. I mean, I understood what it was, the reason was at the time, but I found it quite liberating, and in effect it was like writing it in the third person rather than writing it in the first person. And I think that provided me with a kind of emotional objectivity that enabled me to proceed through some of the worst of it. My son, the subject of this book, which has been out since late spring, only read it last month. Some family members have not been able to read it. But he only read it last month, and I said, after he confessed that, I said, well, what'd you think? And he said, well, it's all about me. I left it at that. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's fine, that's fine. Then his brother told me about a week later, what he meant was, it's all about me, his father. What do you expect? It's a first-person narrative. I mean, come on, Drew. So I expect him to write his own book someday. Now, he did tell his brother also in that conversation that by reading it, he came to much better appreciate the story that we went through, the trauma, the dramas, and all of that. And I think that also amended his attitude towards us. And I could notice that even in the brief time since then. He has been more understanding, less critical and judgmental and all that sort of thing. And so that's been quite useful. I'll read you some excerpts from the book, and I'll provide you with some observations from our ever-changing now, And some of these may sound familiar, many of them may not, but I hope they're all of some interest or value to you. And I will certainly welcome questions afterwards. The conference as a life deals with life in all of its kind of richness, the full spectrum of severity, of resources, and stages of healing. And me, not being a professional, I'm going to ask the 5-year-old question, why? And the other question, which is, why not? And I'm going to try and, in those observations, find a bigger picture theme that we might be able to work with. You know, I can't offer to you, the professionals, which are about half the audience, any particular tools, but I did write the book to provide the observations to the nursing community about life on the other side of the bed, from the other side of the bed. So I came here on a bit under false pretenses, and I was asked to tell you some things, but really what I'm going to do is to put out these observations that I'm going to ask you to respond. And so because I'm relatively new to this, and since I'm relatively new, I get to ask the dumb questions. And I'm hoping that some of those questions are questions that resonate with you, that some of you may not have felt that you could ask. And that we may get some answers out of that. And the answers can come to me at any time. I'm in a continual process of learning. You know, what better audience to ask those sorts of questions of than this audience? The richness of the experience, the richness of the professional knowledge. I mean, you just couldn't find a better audience. Before this kind of official Q&A, that is not my questions, but the official Q&A, there's going to be a kind of sensual end to the talk. And I'll tell you about that later. And, but in the meantime, I'm going to tell you some observations so you know where this thing is coming from. Now, one of my favorite bands, along with Blue Rodeo, which, as some of you may know, is Barb's favorite band, is a band that comes from London, Ontario. Listen for the name. It's the Nihilist Spasm Band. Any of you know it? Show of hands. You don't know it? You don't know what you're missing. The only criteria to join the band is you must not know how to play music.
I think I've got about half an hour.
They have been around since '65, and they performed all over the world to a very appreciative audiences and a great, you know, they've developed a tremendous reputation. And they play something called irritainment. And one of their doctors, one of their members is someone who moonlights as a doctor in London. And one of my favorite pieces that they perform is one that he is featured in, and it's basically a whine. What about me? Well, let me tell you about me. April 5th, 2008, that first Saturday in April promised to be the first beautiful day of spring. We were expecting our eldest son, 32-year-old Drew, to arrive for the weekend from his trackside loft in the area called the Junction in the west end of Toronto. We were looking forward to seeing him on his own for a few days, a very rare occurrence. He had a full life with his high-tech job, servicing global clients, and his electronic music composing and DJing under stage name Mental Floss. And this was the love of his life for which he had developed a global reputation since his mid-teens. At 12:10, vacuuming the kitchen, I didn't hear the phone. Minutes later, my wife Rachel handed me the phone saying gravely, "Listen to this, it's the police about Drew. I'm going to get ready to leave." I phoned the sergeant at the scene who gave me the basic information, including that Drew was okay, but had a fractured skull and had lost a lot of blood from a head wound. He had given the police his name, spelled it out, but wasn't answering any other questions. He had walked with the police some 300 meters to the emergency vehicles. The officer said they didn't know exactly what had happened as there were no witnesses, but they assumed that he had been hit by a train. This was a kilometer down the tracks from his home, which was adjacent, in a loft area adjacent to the tracks, and so on. At 1 o'clock, we arrived at the first hospital. By accident, Rachel and I walked into the off-limits emergency triage room. We saw Drew's unmistakable legs, and walking closer saw with great relief that he had no apparent injuries below his nose. From there on up, his head was wrapped. The waiting room for the 7 of us family members was a claustrophobic 8 by 15 feet. So I went to meet with the police. Minutes later, the ER doctor told us that the electronic scan showed that Drew's brain injuries were so serious that they were sending him by a special ambulance to the first neurologically specializing hospital that could take him. This was more serious than we thought, but Drew had talked to the police, walked with them to the ambulance. We had no doubt that he would be fine. Hour 2. The ambulance crew invited Rachel and me to accompany Drew in the ambulance. She sat with Drew, I sat with the driver. A parking lot pothole caused a severe metallic crashing noise in the back of the EMS, but the technician said everything was fine. As he slowly drove into the street, the driver called dispatch asking them to tell St. Michael's ER that we would be there in 9 minutes. Good luck, I thought. It's mid-afternoon on the first nice Saturday of spring, so the 8 kilometers of streets between us in West Toronto and St. Mike's in Central Toronto were going to be jammed with cars and pedestrians. Either you're fibbing, I thought, to make certain that the emergency team is ready when we arrive, or you know some route that I don't. We turned east onto Queen Street West. As we drove through the first main intersection, the driver pulled into the left lane, accelerating head-on into the oncoming traffic. Then he turned on every siren and flashing light the ambulance had. Suddenly, I felt enormous fear. What does the driver know that I don't? We drove very quickly, either on the wrong side of the road or in the center of the street on a frequently weaving lane that the ambulance driver created with the forced cooperation of the traffic. As we passed many places Drew and I had visited together, I wondered, is this the last time Drew will ever be here? In spite of 2 initially uncooperative motorists, we arrived at St. Michael's in less than 9 minutes. My earlier lack of fear had not been the result of denial, but rather the result of the positive police report about Drew's behavior after the injury, my own observation of Drew, and the calm professionalism of the medical staff, but most of all, my ignorance. Hour 3. We were sent to the 9th floor neurotrauma room, waiting room. We walked in, and briefly in denial, I thought, we don't belong here with these exhausted, grim-faced people. And I'm sure they thought the same about us. At 9:30, more than 4.5 hours since the start of this 2-hour procedure, an assisting surgeon appeared. I stopped the surgeon from starting his report until we could collect all 7 of us into the empty waiting room. We were all standing. As the surgeon made small talk, I noticed that the pant legs of his hospital greens were soaked in Drew's blood. His 5-minute briefing was detailed and matter of fact. Drew had lost a lot of blood and received quite a few transfusions. A fractured vertebrae in his neck, 2 broken ribs, bleeding in the chest, and a partially collapsed lung. Badly swollen eyes and possible irreparable damage to the eyes. Chipped teeth, a broken nose, and a badly fractured eye sockets, forehead, and left side of his skull. Bone fragments in his brain, which they had removed. His brain was bleeding at the frontal lobe, the left temporal lobe, and at the base of the brain where it joins the brainstem at the spine. An extremely badly swelling brain that the doctors can do nothing about except to let it swell by removing the front half of his skull, from his eyebrows and ears to the top of his head. Drew was in the deepest coma short of a vegetative state. Sensing the devastation that his information had created, from compassion but without apparent conviction, the surgeon added, well, of course he's young. He could beat the odds and survive. We plunge into numbing depths, our lived normal ripped from us forever. Initially, we are all so stunned that we can't console each other. One brother faints to the floor. One brother, a former ocean lifeguard, trained and experienced in dealing with traumatic injuries, is distraught. Alexandra, his wonderful girlfriend of a year who barely knows Drew, is equally devastated and appears lost. With JJ needs you, I send her to console my son. Hour 10, 9:45. Hospital staff take us to the quiet room dedicated to such circumstances. It is a pull-out bed we don't discover for 3 days, laying on the floor instead. We displace a family originally from Mauritius, the young wife and mother of which was hit 2 days before by a young drunk driver. We bond through grief. 2 days later, they take her off life support. Hour 11. After staff settled Drew into the neurotrauma ICU, my wife and I start 1 hour round-the-clock shifts by his side. As I pass the nurse busily dedicated to Drew 24/7 and enter her side-curtained ICU cubicle, I see a lifeless Drew lying in subdued lighting, connected by at least a dozen tubes and wires to about 24 square feet of instrumentation rising above him, quietly beeping or making other gentle noises. Drew's wrapped, swelling head had already swollen to more than double its size. I sit, taking his hand in mine, and kiss it. Hi, Drew. It's Dad. I love you, Drew. Then in the blink of an eye, I had this internal conversation. How do I survive this? Well, you have to accept that Drew is dead. Given his extensive brain damage, if he survives, he might never be able to hear, see, talk, or feed himself, perhaps dying is best. No. I will accept him in whatever his condition. Now what do I have to do to bring him back? That was in the blink of an eye. At that moment, an electric shock passed from his hand to mine, similar to strong static electricity, but not unpleasant, and I said, he's in there. But it was much more than that. Now I realized that the electric shock was calling me to experience Drew beyond his battered body, to experience a healthy Drew who was very present to me, and I to him. We had communicated connection in its purest form. I recall that this essence of Drew was healthy, calm, vibrant, quite different from and independent of the battered body. Reliving his presence, I wonder now if he might have been observing, evaluating, deciding, or even redeciding. Then I experienced a deep, lasting peace. And so it has been. Part of Rachel's own bedside dialogue the next hour was, whatever God decides, I will accept. And so we passed the night. With that peace also came an awareness that all my fears were not gone, but were simply stored in a sack of dread that I now carried on my back and feared would rupture. Also came a partial defense against rupture, withdrawing into a rolling 10 seconds of existence, the eternal present in which we live for many months. The past and the future were banished, as was any part of the world more than 10 seconds away. We read no media, we watched no television, we listened to no radio. Why is my internal dialogue important? I think that I had to experience Drew's death to ensure his resurrection. That sentence may appear to be border on the sacrilegious, but I don't mean it to. Perhaps there are useful resonances there for others to consider. I cannot, not yet. Had I attempted to save Drew from death instead of striving to bring Drew to life, would I have become so emotionally destroyed that I could not have helped him? Would I have been so focused on myself that I would not have had enough energy, will, or mental resources to help him? Would my fear and emotions have drained me to the point of impotence? Upon reflection, there might be a debate about what could be characterized as the obligation to the injured versus an overriding obligation to the self in order that you survive so that you can help the injured. However, is there not always obligation to our injured child never to give up, to fight by every means possible to prevent them dying? Was I selfish in accepting that Drew was dead? Or was it absolutely necessary in order that he might transcend death, that his vital essence be reunited with a viable body? It was 3 years after the event, while writing this book, that I became aware of this alternative. However, I cannot consider it or discuss it further, for to do so would require me to go within myself, to a place and time I can never truly visit again because of the sack of dread. The next morning, Drew's brother Neil set up the Facebook site, Drew Powell is in the hospital. The first posting was day 2 at 10:20 a.m. Ultimately, 800 people registered. There were 47 pages of daily updates, 948 messages, and 66 pictures posted by others. This site also fed thousands of people via hyperlinks from other websites run by both Drew's industry and music communities. In order to be on top of developments, many registrants kept Facebook open on their computers, simultaneously dreading and compulsively reading the twice daily postings. Now, the following are some excerpts edited and annotated. The annotations explain what was really happening at the time, but we couldn't report or later came to learn or to understand. Day 1. As we read these messages, the nurses would gather around. This was neurotrauma ICU, and they said, what a wonderful person he must have been in order for so many people to love him so much. He was becoming a person to them. And in an odd sense, he was becoming a person to us too. Quite different from the person that we knew. A group of these atheistic and agnostic friends held a prayer vigil that night in a park in Toronto. Within days, there were prayer vigils in a mosque in Dubai, a convent of nuns in Haiti, Buddhists in Toronto, and Christian churches in Canada, Australia, and England. He did survive the first critical 36 hours. Then, even in the coma, he began to show responses to inflicted pain, a nurse's knuckle pressed into his breastbone. The signs of progress came along intermittently, including such things as intensive chest congestion, allergic reactions to medicines, etc. Day 15. Rachel called the incoming assigned nurse at the morning shift change, as she did every day. Moments later, I pasted to Facebook, Drew Powell were Drew's first words. His voice is hoarse. He has now been off the ventilator for 24 hours. I could hug you all. I may set off to the hospital in my PJs. Later in the day, report in the second posting of the day, I love you, Drew spoke. When the nurse was helping him cough and clearing his breathing passages, he spoke a fair amount, but for the most part it was not intelligible except for more and thank you. But from the time to time he spoke clearly. The music calms me down. We were constantly playing music, his music and the music that he loved, as well as reading all of these Facebook postings over and over and over again. He was referring to the ambient CD that Neil had prepared. Rub, he said to his aunt, who had stopped rubbing the sole of his foot. And to both his parents, he said separately, I love you. On the day that the leaf buds opened on the trees outside the hospital, Drew said, I love you. One of the nurses who admitted Drew to neurotrauma ICU 15 days ago was on duty today. Drew's mother, Rachel, said to her, Drew said his name this morning. It's amazing. The nurse replied, no, it's a miracle. Day 16. The doctor who was in charge of emergency when Drew was brought in was in ICU today and was overheard saying, I didn't expect to see him here. When Drew's mother left tonight, Drew tried to kiss her goodbye in spite of the oxygen mask and the wrist restraints. The same day, I stood 10 feet away asking a nurse, Natalie, a question, and she replied in detail. I looked at Drew and at Neil, who was with him at the time. Drew was facing me, even though I knew that his sight had not returned. For some reason, I waved at him. He waved back. I was dumbfounded. He saw me. The doctor in charge of the ICU today, who had been in charge of the ICU the day after Drew was admitted, and at that time had given us the straight goods, removing from us any expectations, focusing us on the now, was the kind of anesthetic our emotions needed. Today he agreed that Drew was substantially exceeding expectations. He said that Drew would be sent to the higher neural function school, which he explained was not really a school, but a category for those who stood a good chance of returning to normal. Now, prior to the wave, Natalie had been explaining to me what Drew had just gestured to Neil with both hands, the salute with the first and fourth fingers extended, and the second and third fingers closed, while saying to Neil, "Party." This was an indication of his fine motor skills, Natalie said. This is the highest level of physical functioning. He still has much to overcome, but Drew's word today is party. Day 19. This evening he asked his parents our ages. When we told him, he said, "Holy crap." It made us feel better when he said the same thing when we told him his age. He hadn't regained memory of the previous 9 years. Well, bits and pieces were there, was for the most part not. It did come later. On the other hand, he talked on for 5 minutes about parallel processing and how we allow overanalyzing to add to the burden of useless information that inundates the margins of our lives. I kid you not. This is 19 days in. I told him that you lot, the people on Facebook, were looking forward to hearing the music that he would create after his experience. Cool. I can see lyrics and then riffs building on them, then more riffs, all of it organic. But I think that I'll let it play around inside for a while first. Day 22. I'm standing in neurotrauma ICU basically near the desk, opposite the nurse's station, opposite his bed. And they're preparing him to get him on his feet. I'm standing talking to his aunt. And they get him up, and they disconnect him and move the elements that he has to carry with him up. And he's standing there. Now, he's in his hospital gown. He's been there, 20 days, lost a lot of weight, muscle tone, all of that. He's got a cervical collar on. He's got a badly bruised face, and his skull's removed, and it's still wrapped. Quite a sight. And I'm standing there talking to his aunt, and he gets up on his feet with the help of 3 or 4 people, and then he does this. He comes to his aunt, and we're horrified. We're shocked, this, as you can appreciate, and he puts his arms around his aunt's neck and kisses her. So there was his ability with a sense of humor at that point to conjure that, knowing that it would, and he hadn't even seen himself, knowing that he would create this concern and then turn it into something so beautiful was truly amazing. Through all of our conversations with the doctors, you will notice that I've never said anything about the doctors ever saying that Drew would survive. We never asked. They never told us. But on the other hand, in the delivery room, do you ask the pediatrician, what's the warranty period? It's not a question that's appropriate, in spite of the fact that many friends will ask this question. Day 111, he left hospital, the 4th hospital, Bridgepoint Rehabilitation. We immediately went to an office party that was being held, it was mid-July, we were at the docks. And he's there without a skull, he's got this black skull cap that his ex-girlfriend knitted for him, and got the cervical collar still on, and it's a little worse for wear. But can't wait to get to this party, and all the friends just gather around, and it's sort of a great party, and asking him all kinds of questions and so on. Day 616. This is 20 months for those of you that are math challenged. He returned to work, part-time, half-day, 2 half-days a week. Built up the full-time, but the energy that it took to heal into work were just incompatible. And so after 2 years later, he took another sabbatical, and he's been sort of on that for the past year. And it took him months and months and months to get that energy back that he had lost during that period. As we were emerging tentatively from our rolling 10 seconds of existence into the constantly changing nows, daily, even hourly, we had to recalibrate our expectations, our analysis, our attitudes, and our behavior. It's still ongoing. As for normal, that term, I discovered I could no longer relate to it. In a world that used it as a single word language defining, it was as if I sort of woke up in the middle of a ping pong game to find I was the ball. I really could not and cannot relate to that word. I was conflicted, bothered, and bewildered, which is part of the reason why I wrote under the pseudonym. Recently, I started to examine normal, not so much in a microscope, but as a kind of autopsy. For me, I'll share with you the results, but for me, as I said, it never really is a term that it has life to it. Now, our traditional parental role, and I'm talking about an adult son who at the time was 32, you're still got this role model, and you go through life, you get habits, each of us gets habits, adhere to moral, religious, social, political, and economic norms. We leave our rebellious childhood behind, and we adhere to certain norms, expectations, benchmarks. Effectively, we kind of ISO life, International Standards Organization. We stabilized life with job, spouse, family, hobbies, and we pass those benchmarks on to each succeeding generation, on to our children, on to our nieces and nephews, and so on. I always encourage my children to be the best they could possibly be, but I also included the caveat, you can also be who you want to be if you accept the cost. Conformity, non-conformity has certain expenses. You have to make those judgments. People aren't always aware that there is that. And then a train drives through your life. It could have been a hockey defenseman driving your head into a stanchion. It could have been a drunk driver. It could have been texting while you're crossing the street. It could have been a stroke. So what did my advice, accepting the cost, mean now? What were they to evolve to be that didn't have a cost that they weren't prepared to pay? Would they recognize what those costs were? Could they make that connection between those things? The traditional parental role was also no longer appropriate. We have always been different, one from another, him from us, and so on throughout life. There was no sort of normal. We cannot expect that child to live to be the life that we had. We cannot live their lives. In this particular case, both of us are older than we were when he was a teen, when he left home. He's an adult male, but at times he cannot judge the costs of what his actions are. I'll give you some examples. The professionals counseled us on the reality of the injured brain. His was similar to, they said, to having 5 concussions. A subsequent brain injury could be fatal, might not be. Warned about alcohol, drugs, bicycling, skiing, all of those things that would risk his head, because right now the frontal part is primarily polycarbonate and titanium. They tried to put back the bones that they had recovered, but many of them weren't viable. They had to go in and replace that with substitutes. However, it is important, and it has been important, that we get him to make his own decisions. We can't live his life for him. Making mistakes is part of living, learning the consequences. But there's a kind of progressive continuum that we had to go through with him, because we were making those judgments that he couldn't possibly make. But we had to recognize at each stage he was continually pressing, continually forcing us, demanding, and we had to know when to give in, to let him still be safe, but at the same time to learn from his own decisions. Now, he's going to live a lot longer than I am, hopefully, and consequently, we're not going to be around to protect him. We can't be around to protect our children. And we ran into this with alcohol and with smoking. He drinks a small amount of wine, I pour it for him and so on, but he's doing it quite moderate fashion. He's taken up smoking again, but I think he's actually quit again, which is wonderful. But here he is in this world which is, for the most part, with people that know his condition, know his history. Kind of artificial. At this very moment, it's about mid-morning where he is. Hawaii. Starting towards the end of August, he went to Nevada, to Burning Man, with 60,000 of his closest friends. He then went with some of them to San Francisco, stayed with them for 10 days. He decided, well, I'm pretty close to Hawaii. It's a lot closer to get there from here than it is from Toronto, so I think I'll go to Hawaii. So we don't know exactly what he's doing there. We get some reports back, but he phones his brothers from time to time, and they slip us the real information from time to time. But I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's an important part of his process. He's there with people who have no idea what his history is. They're judging him for who he is now, not for who he was. They're not judging him from Drew 1. They're not judging him for anything that was in his past. And this is an important for him in terms of his self-confidence and self-esteem building, but it's also extremely important for him in terms of testing himself against the real world. The feedback that he's getting from those people, negative and positive, is all part of his learning and calibrating process, which he has to do. I mean, he's Drew 2. He's not Drew 1. He has to calibrate Drew 2. I hope he's having a wonderful time. You know, what a chore. Where do I go for coffee on the beach? And it wasn't always the case. In the third hospital, he was in there on his own. This was towards the end of June. A friend went to see him, a young woman. And they went out for a walk behind the hospital, which is in the woods. And the hospital happened to be near where we live, so he knew these particular woods. And he persuaded her to go out with him into the woods. The problem is that he had a 1/4 inch of skin between the first sharp stick and his brain. They walked through an area where the light is very poor because of the trees. There are roots and rocks in the path. And they came safely back to the hospital. But you can imagine our concern. And I had a discussion with him, and then I did a posting on Facebook and saying, you know, you got to be careful of letting him persuade you, because he's very persuasive, he's quite articulate and so on. I said, if you're there and he suggests something that you think is not appropriate or that you really want to test, ask the professional staff, because he trusts them and he will do what they say. Don't let him talk you into doing something like that. I mean, the last word of my posting, you can imagine what we'd gone through, was "arg." There was also the strap of death. Now, he frequently carries his junk around in a backpack, always has. You know, he's a techie and that kind of stuff. And he was going to and from his therapies. And one of the things that he had in his backpack was a strap was hanging down. You know, and I said, you got to tuck that in. And he kept saying, no, I don't. You know, I've done this for years. And I said, there's no problems. And I said, Drew, you got to tuck it in. You can't have that hanging down. Because if you get on the subway and you go into that car and that strap hooks onto something, or you're walking through the car and somebody catches it or it catches a seat and you bang into somebody with your head, you've got no protection. The risk is very high. And anyway, his mother didn't see the risk, and his therapist didn't see the risk. And I pointed out to them that if he gets hit in the front, there's nothing to protect his brain. If he gets hit in the back where he has skull, think of an egg that's cracked open. Think of how much integrity there is in the remaining part of the egg. So, you know, I had worked as a student, I had worked in factories and places like that. So I had been trained in some of this sort of stuff, but you know, you sort of got to make these judgments. And had he had an accident, the problem obviously is that the therapists, the parents and so on would judge themselves as being quite, you know, quite complicit in that. And that's a real difficult problem. I want to sort of move forward a little more quickly because there's some things I want to get through. So, we got to go through this parental caregiving role model. What is it that we are expected to do? What is the appropriate? I think a father's post-critical care to a child, to a son particularly, is not to do for him, but to provide him with unconditional love and support and guidance to self-sufficiency. But most important of all may be to be the best possible role model. Funnily enough, that is one of his gifts to me. And I've learned a lot from him. This trip to Hawaii, basically, he's trying to decide, is Drew 2 to Drew 1, as Superman to Clark Kent. What's the story? But he had to leave Smallville to find out. Drew taught me a lot, and I gained a lot of benefits. We've all, as a family, gained a lot of benefits from this whole experience, and I've heard others speak today about those gaining benefits as well. This is not a tragedy. Some of these experiences for people are tragedies. We're very fortunate and very lucky. He had basically three miracles to bring him to us in the condition that he's in. But there are a lot of other ancillary benefits. I'll name one. He had to go out. He wanted to go DJing because that's what he'd done for many years. His own music, other music, and so on. And he had this large group of friends, as I mentioned, Burning Man. But, once a month through the summer, spring, winter, or fall rather, they go out and they do these, the 300 or 400, 600 people go out for a long weekend and they play music and dance and all that sort of stuff. And he really had to go. He wanted to go. And one of these groups said, sure, come DJ for us. But he wanted to go camp, 3 days in the woods, no skull. I didn't want him to do that, but I wanted him to go DJing. So his brother and I drove him up to Huntsville, and he DJ'd. He did his set, and then the guy after him didn't turn up, so he did his set too. So about 1 a.m, he's done. He needs about 12 hours sleep a day, and we're now 1 a.m. He's fried. And he has the most raging headache. He's still in that period where the headaches are there, and they're really severe. But for me to go up there with him as this kind of roadie and security, was my get out of jail card. And I'm 25 again. I get to go to party with all of these people, many of them hugely attractive. They are all over him, hugging him and kissing him and crying and so on. And inevitably they end up hugging and kissing the closest other person with them, and including this old guy, this old roadie, It was just fantastic, and I learned a lot from this community. This is a hugely supportive community, and I made a lot of friends with these people. One of the things that we learned about him, we had to make this adjustment, was that he, in his appearance, was obviously not what you would normally expect. And I had to take guidance when we went to a number of restaurants. Going out, he was still in the hospital. His brothers and I would take him out to a restaurant. Now he's still got this black skull cap. He's still sometimes got staples in his head. He's got stitches in his forehead, got the wonky eye, and all of this sort of stuff. If that had been me, I would not have shown my face. But it was him. Now, whether that was lack of inhibition because of the frontal lobe injury at the time and it wasn't fully healed, or whether he knew and said, screw it, I'm just going. And he was completely fine with this. And I said, if he's fine, I should be fine. And so we were. But I tell you, if I look at the photographs that we took at Alan's patio up on the Danforth, I just get really queasy. Because I can't imagine what those poor people saw. But I must say the waitstaff were just perfect, absolutely perfect. But anyway, we're learning from him. We learn from the patient. 38 days after his pierced and dramatically swollen brains seemed to doctors to be too damaged to support life, Drew's brain decided that I am not worse, not better, just different. He told a friend of his this. I knew this friend. I was tremendously affected by that when he said that at that time, particularly given that it was sort of 38 days in, that he had that sufficient judgment to make that kind of determination for himself. He was not anxious about it. He had made that decision. He hadn't even seen himself in the mirror yet. I was really impressed at the time because I've been applying, I'm a former, executive, and I've been making judgments about people and hiring people and creating jobs and job descriptions and all that sort of things at all levels, technical, administrative, executive, and so on. And you kind of set up the benchmarks, and you pigeonhole them, you drop them in, you slot them, and that sort of thing. And that comment of his made me think, how are we as a society so screwed up that we do these sorts of things to each other? Are we commodifying ourselves? Are we commodifying people so much that we're no longer treating them as individuals? Then, months later, as I was sort of working on the book, I thought about what he said again. And it had a tremendous impact on me in a very kind of positive way. The guy he said it to was a guy he'd worked with for a number of years. He was born with no hand. And he has severe hearing problems. Neither the three of us completely ignored this in this context. I mean, his friend could have said the same thing. I'm not better, not worse, just different. But we didn't even think about it. We just accepted it. And it means that you can't accept these things. Society can't accept things. They just need the familiarity in order to be able to do that. So you value the individual. You not value the components. You don't talk about the deficiencies. You talk about the assets that those people are and have. He has some insights too about, for example, his aging grandmother, who's 94, and is, her short-term memory is not what it was. She continually returns into that kind of past, and he sort of relates to that, and he understands it, and so on. And this has actually been quite good for us to see this. And occasionally his parents have mental lapses as well, memory lapses, and and it's good for him because he sees this as an acceptable part of the human condition. He doesn't see this as some sort of worrying personal deficiency. He's sort of getting that judgment, that balance back, and it's really important for him, and it's important for us. I mean, as his parents, some years ahead, go into that same rearward-looking state. He and his brothers will look on that with, I think, hope, a tremendous amount of humor and patience and love, and accept it. Now, so I'm talking about all of these things. These are all versions of normal. What's normal? What's the deficiencies with normal? One of the things that I want you to sort of end with, in a sense, is talking about what we can do, the kind of subversive things to change society, to get society to allow all of the work that you folks are doing to have greater impact, because we're talking about a society that's accepting, that's understanding and accepting. And it's not just about brain injuries. It's about a number of other conditions, too, that are deviations from the normal, if you want to sort of put it in that horrible expression. So one of the subversive activities that I'm suggesting is that I'm going to try to stop using the term normal at all. And if anybody challenges me or whatever, I'll say I can't use that term. It doesn't fit. You're not looking at the whole. The sum is greater than the parts. Look at the sum greater than the parts. Don't try and squeeze everybody down to a widget that fits in a hole. Normal is a cycle on a wash machine? Thank God I don't do any of that. Maybe I should get a can of spray paint and I mean, the alternative is that when one person in a family gets a brain injury, everybody gets a brain injury. That may be kind of explaining my particular situation. And there are lots of other signs, gifted non-conforming people that have schizophrenia but are brilliant artists, brilliant mathematicians, brilliant theoretical physicists, and so on. There are some people from the L'Arche community, Jean Vanni's L'Arche community, who are brilliant artists. And that judgment has actually been rendered about works of art that we have in our house by L'Arche community members, core members. That judgment was by somebody who has works of art in major institutions all around the world, including a bunch over here at the National Gallery. He looked at this, didn't know it was a L'Arche created by somebody from L'Arche, said, this is brilliant. He was flummoxed. He was for the first time I've known him, could not respond when we told him. This was one of the core members who largely created these two works. Okay. I think we have an advantage in Canada for doing this. I think our multicultural environment has taught us how to embrace the new. I think our young people growing up in schools with 84 different cultural groups represented, different countries come from, I think they have a huge advantage in terms of embracing the new. They look for it as part of the exotic. And I think that as a group and as related groups, we should be trying to play on that. We should be playing in that kind of richness. You know, creating works of art, performances, finding other ways to sort of bring that to bear. How that's done, I don't know. Some of you will know, and I know there are some other speakers here that are going to be addressing some of that. Now, two things I'm going to end up with that are very related. Patients in comas and patients near, and this comes from the book, patients in comas, patients near death must be helped to orient themselves towards life and the present place and time, which to them are relative to each moment. This realization is very important because we're all on journeys all the time. Those asleep in a coma or trauma are no different in that regard. The difference between them and us is that their grasp of time, spatial orientation, and facts may be completely derailed by their brain injury. They may be unable to tell the difference between reality, dreaming, or death. Being unable to tell the difference, in which direction will they orient themselves? My guess is that left alone, they will orient themselves towards the near future that they perceive to be the easiest, most pain-free, or the most peaceful. That place may be death. Although we now know that the brain has great neuroplasticity, we know that neuroplasticity rewiring is implemented slowly, over considerable time, perhaps as much as 10 years, much like the 10,000 hours required to learn a new skill. However, in order to survive, a traumatized brain needs rewiring immediately. The first 36 hours of healing are the most critical to survival. The brain is drowning in chaos. Throw it a rope. To use another drowning metaphor, lifeguards are taught that when rescuing a drowning person, that they must push the life jacket or reaching pole firmly, even harshly, into the victim's chest or stomach. This will force them to grab onto it. I say to medical professionals that can use their professionalism as that reaching pole. And this is specifically addressing nurses. This comes from the section in the book addressed specifically to nurses. But they do not have, with any patient, the more effective reaching pole, blood harmony. And I borrowed that term, blood harmony, from music. It basically refers to singing families that have, through DNA, through nature and nurture, the ability to sing with harmonies that professional singers, no matter how good they are, cannot duplicate. The way your chest capacity is built, the way your resonant cavities are built, your vocal cords can't be duplicated. But in the womb, you can hear family singing. When born, you're engaged in family singing. You're sitting on the laps, you're in the room, you're doing all that. And then eventually you sort of join in, and eventually you find your harmonic range and others adjust and so on. It's extremely critical. A loosely similar medical term I found out was called entrainment. And to the nurses, I urge you to use your professional centrality to this life-death tipping point, that is the coma, to immediately engage the family in the many ways that they can use their shared blood harmony to guide and to encourage the patient towards life and consciousness. Those many ways include kissing, which is touch and olfaction, and it also engages chemoreceptors, hand-holding, massaging, talking, storytelling, jokes, news, singing, music playing. And in the book I give some quite specific examples about how blood harmony might be used. This is for families. There's a to-do list in there as well. It's in that. So Nurses emphasize to the family that until the patient is out of danger, they should use these tools as frequently as they can, with the obviously medicated, necessitated exceptions. And I suggested that by enlisting the patient's close family and friends effectively in the caregiving process, is that you will be more effective in treating that patient, and you will also create the collaterally healed. Even if the patient dies, you will not only take satisfaction knowing that you did your best for that patient, but you will also take great satisfaction knowing that you healed many other people walking your community, who in turn will use their experience to heal others. Call it the power of one, you. We were at a family wedding a year ago. Friends of ours were there, sitting at our table. My son Drew talked to them, and I just heard this the other day. Was talking to them. He was telling them how important music and talking and other things were to him in the coma. Now, can we verify that? What stage of the coma was he in? Or was it later on? Who knows? But we do know at the time that his response to these things was important. And I'll give you one example. He was in the coma. I was sitting with him, holding his hand, and he started tapping out with his fingers a rhythm. He was in the coma. He was tapping, and it was a rhythm. It wasn't random, it was repeated. I took his hand and I started tapping the same rhythm back on his hand. And then he started tapping it again on my hand. And technically, he was in a coma. Now, it's not scientific evidence, but it works for me. And what have you got to lose? Nothing. And you stand to gain so much. Now for that sensual experiment that I promised, the erotic moment. I want you all to close your eyes. Now I want you to remember a particularly memorable kiss. And to remember the smell of that other person. Could be a parent, could be a grandparent, could be a child, a favorite aunt, a spouse. Just remember it and savor the moment. Thank you very much. Merci. Questions? Answers?